See, I'm a former Van Buren boy now. The Van Buren Boys was a good episode. Liked it a little bit better than The Money. We had a couple little stories. And an interesting one, of course, that will have a follow-up story later on down the line as well. That's kind of like a follow-up from a story from this episode, but also kind of a follow-up from something in real life that happened as well. But we'll get to that, of course, in a little bit, which is something that, we kind of expected to happen from the real Kenny Kramer, the dude, saying that he is the real Kramer. Well, Kramer is trying to make the case that he is the real J. Peterman, but that's in a further episode. But where is that idea coming from? Let's talk about, of course, the Van Buren Boys episode, to which two of the main characters have had encounters with the Van Buren Boys. So, the biggest story, well, there's two big stories in this episode. The first one is Elaine's been given a huge project by Mr. Peterman to write an autobiography for him. However, though, after following Peterman around with his, out of work life, she finds out that Peterman's actually quite boring. So she really has nothing to fill in the blanks, around his actual work. Not like his personal life. So, of course, I guess Peterman went to go order some pizza place that Kramer talked about earlier in the episode. And Elaine tells some story about him. And then Peterman goes, put that in the book. We'll buy the story off of him. So basically, he starts getting this idea that he wants to buy Kramer's stories off of them to use them as his in his autobiography. Which sounded great at first because Kramer got money for it. But then it might cause some problems a little bit later. Kramer, meanwhile, though, was at the pizza place, like Lorenzo's or something like that. And he almost got mugged by a group called the Van Buren Boys. And he was basically doomed until he still had like a garlic shaker in his hand. And he put his hands up like this. And because he put up the 8 fingers, that's the Van Buren Boys sign. They think he's a former Van Buren boy. So he was good. Because Martin Van Buren was the 8th president of the United States. So for now, he's good. But then George, meanwhile, would later deal with the Van Buren Boys. So his storyline is he's still doing stuff with the foundation. And he's been in charge of trying to find the first ever Susan Ross Scholar. It's a scholarship. And Susan's part that'd be donated from the foundation. So George interviews a bunch of, overachieving students. And George, not being smart, just doesn't buy it for them. He doesn't want to use them. Then he meets this student by the name of Stephen Coren, who has a solid 2.0 GPA. And he is president of the chess club. And then, of course, George asks him who his favorite chess player was. Stephen makes up a name, and then he thinks he has no chance. Of course, George obviously sees a lot of himself in this guy. And then he gets even more interested because he then mentions that he wants to be an architect. That's when George basically acts like this guy's won. Because he wants to be an architect just like George always says he's wanted to be an architect. So the time being, we're good with that one, right? And then there's Jerry. His story is he's dating this woman named Ellen. Who's attractive. Seems sweet. But then he starts getting these weird vibes. Because she was checking her messages on a payphone. And while that was going on, she ran into some of her friends. And she gets introduced to Jerry. And they make it seem like that you're doing her a huge favor by going out with her. Basically, like acting like she's some sort of like a charity case. To which Jerry starts getting concerned. He's like, this woman's great, but is she really that great? And then, when I guess talking with George, he advised how, she's probably like the loser of their group. And of course he says the famous line of, everyone has someone in their group they always make fun of. Like us with Elaine. So now, of course, it starts to drive Jerry a little bit nuts. But, of course, none of their friends have met Ellen yet. George also is telling Jerry about how he's introduced the first ever Susan Ross scholar. Mentions how he wants to be an architect, which, of course, I think that's the only reason why they're giving him the scholarship. Well, then George goes back to introduce Stephen Coren to the foundation. And, of course, he mentions the thing. He's president of the chess club. He has a solid 2.0 GPA. And, of course, Wick is there, and he says how this scholarship was supposed to be based firmly on academics. But then, they get to know Stephen more. And, of course, George mentions how he wants to be an architect someday. But then Stephen says, actually, I've thought more about it, and I may want to be more so of like a city planner instead. Which seems to interest everyone in the foundation except George, who feels betrayed because he wanted to be an architect. And then, of course, after talking to them more, the foundation loves him and accepts him as the first Susan Ross scholar. But George, though, isn't happy about it. And he takes away the scholarship from Stephen. How does he retaliate? We'll take a break from that for a second. So, Elaine, meanwhile, is following around Kramer. Peterman even offered Kramer all of his stories for $1,500, to which Kramer accepted. Then he offered Elaine for the opportunity to come to one of his parties with his friends to try to get more ideas. So, of course, Kramer, Elaine goes to Kramer's party, but then Kramer starts realizing he's getting some problems. He starts trying to tell some of his stories, but Elaine keeps stopping him, saying that you can't tell that story because that's not yours. That's not yours. That's Peterman's now. And Kramer starts getting, depressed because, he's realizing that, he's basically sold all of his best stories and he can't tell any good stories anymore. So then George, though, was on the streets. He ran into Stephen, who's not happy that George took his scholarship away. And who does he happen to become friends with? The Van Buren Boys. Basically, they were threatening to beat up George if he didn't give the kid back his scholarship. But George, of course, didn't remember the sign. So he went running off to find Kramer. But, of course, Kramer can't tell his Van Buren Boys story anymore either, because Peterman now owns those stories. So George is dead and beat now. And then finally also, Kramer and George meet Ellen. And they act weird. And then later, Jerry was planning a trip to Vermont with Ellen. Remember the last time he went to Vermont with Vanessa back in, the stock tip back in season 1? Proved to be a relationship killer. But he may get out of this beforehand, because after Jerry tells George is doing that, George gets out of the apartment, walks over, grabs Kramer, pulls him in. And they basically say that, you gotta stop this. She's a loser. And it's like, okay, she's like the loser of her group, but it's like, what do you see that makes her terrible? Like, she was beautiful, she was sweet, she was attractive and everything. But Jerry, is not buying it. So then, obviously, it was still bugging him. So he actually invited his parents to come up to meet her. And they liked her, but they said all the same things. She seems sweet, she's smart, she's this and that. But then Jerry says, she tells him, though, but our opinion, Mrs. Seinfeld said, but our opinion doesn't matter. It matters if you're happy with her or not. And then Jerry's like, I'm not so sure now. We never see her again, so I'm assuming he just dumped her then. Of course, Kramer even tried buying some of Newman's stories, but they all stink. And then, of course, Elaine also is starting to realize that these stories were not making any sense at all in Peterman's book. So Jerry said, just twist and turn him a little bit. Tells her she's a writer, and she embraces it. But then, of course, she shows the first draft to Peterman. Peterman doesn't like it, and then Kramer called Peterman begging to get his stories back. To which Peterman gives them back to him. But Elaine still has to come up with some modified stories. But he even also says, oh, by the way, when you get to my romantic life, feel free to include you in it. Which, of course, freaks Elaine out that, okay, my boss is romantically interested in me, who knows. Well, there was never no romance story between Peterman and Elaine, but he kept, just Peterman being as awkward as he is, kept throwing it out there. Meanwhile, though, George then gets cornered again on the streets by Stephen and the Van Buren boys. George is still not giving Stephen his scholarship back. So basically, they're basically saying, since George can't do the sign, they're giving him one more chance. If he's one of them, they basically want him to mug the next, steal the wallet of the next, old person on the street. Who does that happen to be? Mr. and Mrs. Seinfeld. George is standing there desperately saying, okay, guys, I need you to do me a favor. All right, turn it over to me, old man, or whatnot. And then they weren't taking him seriously, so they walked off. And then George just makes a run for it, as he probably was then beaten up by the Van Buren boys. And I'm guessing Stephen never got his scholarship back. Who really ended up being the first ever Susan Ross scholar? I don't know. So, that's the Van Buren boys. I definitely liked it a little bit better than the Money episode. Definitely not as much as the comeback, but I liked it. See if there's any trivia here. Not really much. The name Stephen Coran, who is the name of the guy who almost got the scholarship, is actually the same name as one of the writers, Steve Coran. And then the actress who played Ellen, Christine Taylor, subsequently ended up marrying Ben Stiller, the son of Jerry Stiller, in there as well. Now, of course, one more thing to mention is not on IMDb, though, but in the inside look for this episode, John O'Hurley talks about a unique scene that Kramer was in. He was at the office. He was putting. He was trying to tell some Bob Sacamano story to Elaine that she could use for the book. And when he's getting ready to leave, he slips on a golf ball and falls. But when he slips on the golf ball, he doesn't fall down. He falls up. Kind of more so like, wiping out to add on a gist of the physical comedy. And of course, there was another sequence of interviews involving Michael Richards, comedy. How he also had to think about comedy, physical comedy being shorter, because obviously they couldn't add on the extra time, because as he says, he would rehearse stuff for the week, but when it came to camera, stuff just happened. But he knew, though, that a lot of the stuff that was longer would be just, a blooper reel or be a deleted scene. So for stuff to actually make the final cut, he had to, shorten his, physical comedy stuff. And he had to, think about that when reading the script. But yeah, he didn't fall down when he slipped on the golf ball. He fell up. Unique way, of course, of doing it. And I like how, of course, they got a close-up of that golf ball and it shot him just flinging up in the air, which is priceless. But that, of course, is the Van Buren boys. Next up is the Susie. Who is Susie? And we also see the return of a man who originally thought that Jerry Seinfeld was a phony. Also a man that Kramer realized he shouldn't try to hustle again. Who was that? Oh, no. We have a couple episodes of that one. The next one is a someone who used to think that Jerry was a phony. And apparently Jerry has not forgotten about it too. Who is that man? We'll talk about him next. So guys, what were your thoughts on the Van Buren boys? Are you a former Van Buren boy yourself? Make sure your thoughts down in the comments section below. Be sure as always to slap a like on the video, subscribe for more content on my channel, follow me on Twitter at DemandAirboy93. Don't take children away their scholarships. Don't ever sell some of your own stories. Keep those stories, that way you can give the best laughs you can all the time. And also, don't believe people when people say your girlfriend's a loser. Because Ellen was a great woman, but of course Jerry was bothered by it. So So that's my thoughts, guys. I'm checking out. I'll catch you guys later in the Susie episode. Have a great rest of your evening. And peace out, everybody.